Hello and welcome. I'm Laura Briggs with the Vegan Fitness Runner podcast, where I'll be talking all things running, health and fitness, and what it means to be an active vegan.
David Starley is a co-founder of the Green Runners, who was last year named in the Edie 30 Under 30 list for shaping the future of sustainability. He's just set a fastest known time for Cornwall's Smuggler's Way, and we chat about the impact of a vegan diet and ways to save the planet. David Starley, official fastest known time now for the Smuggler's Way. Tell me all about it and why you decided to set that FKT earlier on this year.
Well, the Smuggler's Way is a 37-mile or 59-kilometre route from the north coast of Cornwall, Boscastle, to the south coast of Cornwall in Looe. It's really local to me, which is a big thing for me, and we'll maybe get into some of that with the Green Runners. But also I just wanted a challenge, and I wanted to challenge myself so that I could raise some funds as part of the Green Runners crowdfund as well. So that's the why behind it. And yeah, it was an interesting experience. It was harder than I expected. I had to probably push a lot more than I thought I was going to, and dig into a bit of that additional why. And yeah, the route was a big mixture of road, trail, moorland, bog, and finishing in sort of the streets of the touristy coastal town that is Looe. So yeah, a big adventure really.
And very hilly round there. Yeah?
Yeah, relatively. I mean, there's definitely hillier routes you can do, but it was about 1,400 meters of climbing in that length. So yeah, there were a few big hills, but actually, as Cornwall goes, it wasn't that hilly really.
Wasn't so bad. So, okay, what was your time?
So I finished in 5 hours, 51 minutes and 59 seconds.
And you were trying to beat 6 hours, is that right?
Well, it was about 5 hours 57 was the previous best.
Crumbs.
So just 5 minutes under.
By the skin of your teeth, but nonetheless you did it. So that's an amazing achievement. Well done. And this kind of in the background, obviously we've got to talk about the Green Runners. So David, you are a co-founder of the Green Runners, and your kind of part of the drive for you to do this FKT was to push a crowdfund that the Green Runners are currently doing called Race for Change, which is looking to raise £50,000 to make incredible changes in the world of running and sustainability. So can you tell us a little bit more about that, please?
Yeah, well, the Green Runners is a non-profit community interest company, but really we are a community of runners who simply care about our planet and the environment in which we love running. And we would like to see that environment protected for ourselves, but also our future generations as well. And the recognition that the Green Runners makes is that, you know, running is not immune from causing detriment to our environment. There's plenty of fast fashion in the kit that we inevitably buy and use, and equally traveling to races and traveling to your local runs even, and getting out on trails for some people can contribute significantly to climate change through the emissions released. And equally, you know, there are increasingly events that are sponsored by companies that are not supporting the transition that we need to a low carbon environment and society. And in even some cases, there are races directly sponsored by oil and gas companies. So the Green Runners is our conduit and our platform for changing all of that, and using the power of the collective voice through sport to drive for systemic changes.
Fantastic. And I mean, your sustainability, green credentials, David, they go further than the Green Runners. Obviously, as I said, you're a co-founder. But last year, you were also named as one of the 30 under 30 for the Edie list, I guess we could call it, for sustainable heroes, really. What's that all about?
Heroes is a strong word. So, yeah, I mean, the 30 under 30 list is really to recognize sort of young talent in the business world involved in sustainability roles. And it can vary from, human impacts in the supply chain and modern slavery and social issues, all the way across to climate change and environment. And there's a breadth of really diverse people who made the list, and I was fortunate to be one of them last year for my efforts in my role in the company that I work for. And really it's to celebrate those people who are driving those changes in their companies, but also actually to give them a bit of a support network. And it's been really lovely to sort of meet, and we've got a WhatsApp group with all of us on, and it's just such a nice space to be able to share stories, good and bad, with other people who are facing similar challenges as well. And Edie are really good with putting on events and things like that we were able to attend as well, and network with people across the industry. And there was an event I was at recently where I sat next to the head of sustainability for the BBC. So they'd been working in the space for 20 years, and it's just really interesting to get those different viewpoints and learn from other people and what they do in their roles as well.
Does it make you even more hungry, kind of knowing that you've been selected and you are in that space to do better or to work harder for the environment?
I would say yes and no. So yes, because you're surrounded by sort of high performing people as well, and then being in those environments sort of can drive you to want to keep pushing yourself and trying to create even bigger impact. But then the flip side to it is that quite often in the sustainability space, you can feel like you have to do everything because there's, the climate crisis and everything else is so overwhelming that you kind of have to devote your entire life and being to it in order to try and make the change as much as possible. But this then shows you that actually there's quite a lot of people out there who are also really devoted and trying to make change happen, and maybe you can take a couple of hours off now and then.
Yes, you are allowed, honest. Do you think, David, as a runner, because I do believe this, and maybe I'm wrong, but runners, we spend a lot of time outside, so therefore we're quite in touch with nature. Do you think runners inherently care more for the environment than maybe, I'm just going to say non-runners, leave it that vague?
Yes, I do. I think especially runners who go out on trails, I think those who are sort of trapped by the concrete and the tarmac, maybe less so, in the urban jungle, so to speak. But definitely, I think those of us who are able to get out into nature and appreciate essentially the beauty of the world that we inherit and we live in, care more for protecting it. And that's not even, just a thought. It's quite well documented in scientific journals that exposure to nature and being out and spending time in nature drives people to want to protect it more. And that's why we see so many charities and people pushing for more access to nature, as not to mention also the health benefits, of course, and seeing places like Canada prescribing walks in nature as treatment now. So yeah, I definitely think running helps. And besides that, it's also just the genuine direct impact of running. And air pollution is so obvious when I run in London compared to when I run where I live now, which is in Cornwall. You can really tell the difference between the two.
Yeah, without a shadow of a doubt. But it's quite from a kind of green living, or try my best, green runner, it is still fairly demoralizing to know that we still do have a carbon footprint, don't we, as runners? And that is what I guess the Green Runners is really working hard to educate people about. But every time we buy a new pair of trainers, or every time we, travel to a race, these are the kind of things that you want people to think about, isn't it? And what the cost is for all our kit and the stuff that we're eating and how we're getting to races. How would you kind of get that message across to people?
Yeah, I think how we get it across to people is in a Green Runners community-based supportive way. It's not finger pointing. It's not telling people off because they've taken one flight or whatever. It's, first of all, a little bit of education. We need to provide people with the resources and the information so that they can actually make informed decisions in the first place. And so many people don't realize how much of a problem shoes are in the first place. And even the fact that, shoes pretty much aren't recyclable at all, and most of them are just in landfill. The Max Romy film about no lost shoes and them turning up on a random beach in like Alaska is just really, really shocking to watch. So I think there's definitely a bit of information that helps. And then just seeing other people making those changes is so powerful. And again, this is why I think Green Runners is brilliant, because we've got a couple of thousand people who are making changes that are right for them. And so almost guarantee that when someone joins us, someone else has already taken a step that they're thinking of doing, or maybe they're not sure about. But then someone else can give them that nudge or tell them that actually it's not as hard as you might think. And I think there's plenty of people who have said, well, I don't know, I could never buy secondhand shoes or whatever. And then you go on Vinted and actually there's loads of them and they're really cheap and it's easy and it's not that hard. Equally, getting public transport to runs and races, once you've done it a couple of times, it's really not as much of an obstacle as you might think, especially when the race organizers make it easy for you. But so I guess to go back to the question, I think, how do we get people to start changing within running? It's through community, it's through a support network, and it's through some information and education as well.
Now, one of the reasons that I invited you on the podcast, aside from all your amazing achievements and your sustainability kind of passions, is obviously you're a vegan. So we can talk about that a little bit, because from research that is out there, one of the biggest burdens on the environment actually is, the production of animals. So going vegan is a really good thing for the planet, isn't it? Is that the reason you chose that path?
Mostly, yes. I would say the reason I went vegetarian and non-dairy is almost exclusively environmental reasons, specifically the climate impact. And then the final steps to be a fully committed vegan was definitely the ethical question of, is it right to still essentially be paying for animal cruelty, other than when I have a choice for something else that results in less suffering for animals. So the really big part, and certainly the trigger point for me, was the environmental issues, and that led me to learning a lot more about the wider systemic problems of our agriculture industry, and particularly animal agriculture. One of the shocking things is just the sheer impact of beef and cattle farming. It's just enormous compared to anything else. And there's a really big study published in Nature, which I can provide a link to, which you've probably referenced before, Laura. And it was in 2018, and it said, if we're going to stay within 2 degrees, which is not even the Paris Agreement's sort of ambition of 1.5 degrees, then we need to reduce beef consumption globally by 75%. That is enormous reductions in beef. And in the UK and the US, which are, the more developed and the countries that consume vast amounts, it's 90%. So, that just starts to show you the level of, I suppose, damage caused by the beef industry at the moment. Then there's also a 90% reduction in pork. There's a 50% reduction in egg, and 60% reduction in milk. So even before you layer into that the animal rights questions, you're already looking at an enormous reduction in animal proteins and animal products just for the climate question. And we can go into some of the additional stuff as well, but like beef is really bad, but then you add into that all of the animal feed and the soy that's produced and the deforestation and the land challenges that's caused by it as well. And the environmental impacts beyond climate are just so big that for someone like me, I'm very logical. I'm an engineer. I see science and facts, and like I see these numbers, and once I've seen it, I can't get away from that. Like, this is the truth. And so why would I not act upon those numbers that I'm seeing? So yeah, definitely for me, it was beef. It was milk actually quite early on. And I took a bit longer with cheese, as I think most people do, because I did really enjoy cheese.
To go.
Yeah, but ultimately I just asked myself why does it matter? And then once I'd made a commitment, it was no going back.
Do those numbers scare you? Like you just said, you're an engineer, you think rationally, very logical person. To see that kind of statistic in front of you and to think, there must be something in the back of your head, because there is in mine, that says, how the hell are we going to convince people that this is the right thing to do for the environment? Like, does that scare you a little bit?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, a lot of the climate change stats scare me a lot. Probably the visible impacts are the things that become the most scary, because they are so visible, the floods and the temperatures that we're seeing across the world. But yeah, I mean, some of the scale of the reductions, and if you look at now the pathway that we would need to be on in terms of emissions reduction to even have a hope of 1.5 degrees, it's ridiculously steep. And some would say basically impossible at this point. And that's really quite scary. And we've already seen that the 2-degree world that we're likely now to be heading at least towards is not going to be a fun place, to live in, and certainly not for those people in the most affected areas. So yeah, definitely it's pretty scary. And when we see some of the scale of change that's required, it's a lot to take in. And however, I guess to try and put it back to a positive point, there are also some really positive social tipping points that we could achieve in the progress of getting an exponential drive towards the reductions that we require. So it's quite well documented that you need only about 30%, I think, of people to change for it to then change the whole system. So whilst the fact says you need this sort of 90 and 75% reduction, actually you might only need 20-30% of people to achieve that reduction before you get that cascade of the waterfall and the tipping point is reached. So I guess the counter to the problem is that yes, it's actually quite achievable if we think about just reaching that threshold. And that's not that much really, like if we think about it. And then you add into that fact that governments have quite a lot of power, and if we simply switch the subsidies away from animal farming and towards plant-based foods, then you would achieve a lot of that very quickly. So what gives me hope, which is maybe another question, is that we already have all of the tools that we need to change. We just need to do it and have the right political will and leadership.
What I'm seeing, David, and you're far younger than me, is that, say, kind of 5 years ago, definitely 10 years ago, there was talk about this, environmental agenda and climate change, and it was there, but it wasn't really a problem that was at the forefront of everybody's minds. There was other stuff going on. It's only really, for me, in the past couple of years that people are now saying, oh my God, like we've left it too long now. Absolutely, change has to happen right now. And it's gaining momentum. So you work in the corporate world. Do you see this within your peer group, within your workspace? Are you feeling that people are now positively making those changes?
Yes, but I think it varies. So the recent there was a recent global survey done by the UN, and it hit the vast majority of countries in the world. And one of the questions was how people feel about climate change and whether they'd support stronger action from their governments. And something like 80% of people were saying, we really want stronger action. We think this is an important issue, pretty much regardless of the country that they lived in. And much stronger in some of the more affected countries, which maybe is not surprising. So, we know that the vast, vast majority of people globally are now really wanting change and really supportive of things like renewables. I think that vegan diets probably are still more of a challenge because of legacy and tradition being harder to change. But I think what's clear is there is that social sort of desire. But what we're not necessarily seeing, certainly in the spaces that I work in, is that translating into action by those with the power. So in the corporate world, unfortunately, shareholders have pretty much, let's say, most of the power. Especially in more traditional industries, and the company I work for is a fairly old engineering type company where the shareholders of the company are not particularly interested in sustainability. Unfortunately, they are much more interested in profit. And so it creates a very difficult situation for even the leadership of the business, who may agree with many of my questions and challenges around doing more on climate, when they're being pushed by shareholders to increase profit margins and every year. So we still come up against, and in my opinion, this is the biggest blocker to us achieving any of our environmental goals, an economy system or an economic system that prioritizes financial profit over anything else. So I think the doom and gloom part of me says, until that changes, we're going to struggle to make any real headway into the changes we need to see.
And that is it, isn't it? It's always and never has been. Money and power sadly hold such sway that how do you change a system that is so entrenched in profit making and the dollar at the bottom line? How do you make those changes, and how do you make the people at the top say, oh, do you know what, money's not as important as our planet? Because currently, to me, it doesn't seem that that's the way they think at all. Actually, the planet comes secondary to what's in their pockets.
Yeah, and I think the optimist would say that they'll realize eventually, but maybe it'll be too late. But I think what we kind of have to look at is that what's ever changed things previously in history, and quite often the environmental movement refers to things like the civil rights movement and gender equality and women's rights. And if we look at that, it was always a mass of people from the bottom who drove the changes and forced, let's say, the people in power to then make those policy changes that were required to essentially create a better society. So I think what's at least quite clear to me now is that we can't expect any of the people with the power today to actually be the ones to drive the changes. I think it has to be us, and by us I mean everyone that's not one of those people, to be the ones who lead the change. And what does that look like? It looks like being active and involved. It's not just sitting and watching and waiting for someone else to make the change happen. You have to get involved, and whether that's through joining the Green Runners and becoming active in the Green Runners in the running community, or joining your own local group or climate group, or whatever the issue is that you feel passionate about. I think we all have to, and I do think now actually we have to get involved locally. And the only caveat I'd put to that is just that some people have much more capacity than others to do that. And going back to, I guess, the crowdfund point, some of us are quite busy for various reasons. You might have busy family lives, or some of us don't have the financial means to support in those ways, but may be able to give a bit of time. And so I would just encourage everyone to think about what can you contribute in your way to, let's call it a movement. And so, yeah, that's probably what I'd suggest, or that is how we do it. That's how we do it.
And I think it's important to remind people as well that being active or activism doesn't necessarily mean gluing yourself to railings, does it? Or throwing paint over artwork. It can really be grassroots level. It can be something that you might think is really insignificant, but actually it's those little changes that make the big differences, isn't it?
Yeah, and again, to lean on the Green Runners, we give that 50 Shades of Green portrait where we say you can be a real activist and we'd love to have you, but equally we'd love for someone who is maybe right at the start. They don't know where to begin, but they think that something needs to change. They think that it's an important issue. So I think that people need to sort of stop gatekeeping, I guess is a good word, in the environmental space, and start welcoming, everything that is helping us to move in the right direction. And there are different spaces for different types of people. So yes, there are those organizations that will do the direct actions, and those are, in my opinion, quite important. But then equally, we have spaces like the Green Runners, which are open to everyone and really welcoming for all types of people to get involved with, and whatever that looks like for you.
You said earlier about, the guys and girls at the top with all the money and the power, and that they won't make any changes. But I do think there's something to be said for kind of the younger generations. Like, the reasons I make changes are not for me. I mean, obviously, I'd love to see amazing changes in my lifetime, but the changes I feel that I'm making now, I'm probably not going to see, the end result of that, but my children and their children and generations from here, they're the people that are going to see the results of this collective action. So is it possible that the people at the top, or should we just call them, might start to see, if they've got kind of an interest in the next generations, they must have families, there must be something whereby they'll start to see younger people are kind of making those changes. And for me, I think that it's the education of the younger generations that's going to make the biggest differences.
I'll be totally honest, I'm skeptical that the people in power will feel sufficiently driven by their own sort of family and children or next generation. I think they're so entrenched in what their status quo is that they almost can't look outside of that. I think there's very few examples of people who have genuinely done that. And there are some really great examples. Like one that I quote to people is the CEO of Interface, which is a company you might not have heard of, but it's a carpet company.
Okay.
And so they produce, or they do still produce carpet tiles and like for commercial companies and things. So it's a pretty big business. It's a US based business. But in the 1990s, the CEO had a conversation with, I believe it was one of his young members of staff, who asked him what they were doing about climate change. And then he went away and read about it and read the science that was available at the time and just decided there and then the company was going to become a net zero company. And
amazing.
So it was one of the very first companies in the world to be essentially fundamentally carbon neutral and net zero, and then net positive as the framing might be nowadays. All simply because of his sort of epiphany that there was more to life than just making money as a business. So that's an amazing story, but I feel like that's still like less than 1% of leaders who will see that and sort of see the light, to use a bit of a metaphor, I suppose. So yeah, and you know, I've spoken to some senior leaders who say that they really care about it for their kids, but then when it comes down to being able to take any action, it feels like a bit of not necessarily lip service, but that they kind of are hamstrung by the economy, and they're like, oh, well, I'm doing what I can do. or they don't necessarily see that they could do a lot more than what they are already.
I mean, it's policymakers, it's governments, isn't it, that have to make bigger changes. It's easy for us to kind of point fingers at individuals, but I think the system is not cut out for living sustainably. It never was. It was never set up that way, was it?
Yeah. So I do find it a bit easier to say, you know, the system is broken than I would to directly criticize individuals, acknowledging there are certain individuals that I think are
could
not
do better.
And you know, are being obstructive. But I guess to go back to what you were saying about the education of young people, I do think that that's really important, and I do think that will, and I think already is starting to change things. And I guess the ED 30 and under 30 is a great example of that. And we're starting to see a lot more people similar to myself in these large organizations really pushing for them to do better, and becoming the ones who are sort of driving that forward. What I think is maybe missing is the education system itself is not really playing its part yet. So we're getting a lot of great progress probably without even having the education system supporting it. You know, certainly in secondary school in the UK, which is something I'm familiar with, I can't talk about necessarily other countries, it's completely inadequate what people are being taught in the curriculum around climate change and the reasons why we've got to where we are in the first place, which, going back to that point, is because of the profit-driven economy and the obsession with fossil fuels and the role that big oil and also big agriculture has played in lobbying for policy making to suit their interests and financial interests in particular. But none of that's currently in, you know, school textbooks, and the curriculum is very hesitant to put anything in that's sort of maybe critical of certain people or companies, I think. So let's start by improving the curriculum.
Absolutely. It's these institutions, isn't it, that they kind of are our foundations, and education is obviously one of the biggest foundations for how we develop our beliefs and our understanding about the world around us. I mean, the other one for me that drives me crazy is the NHS and the whole plant-based food system, and them not educating healthcare workers and them not providing plant-based food when they know that it is much better for you. So it's things like that that are, as we say, entrenched, and just to me, and probably to you, it seems like the most obvious things to be bringing in and educating people about, but it's just still not happening. It's frustrating to say the least, but we are going to turn this round back to positive stuff. So talk to me, David, about some of the things that you do now that you maybe didn't do before you joined the Green Runners, that you actively do now to kind of, do better for the planet.
Yeah, so I guess the really tangible stuff is the kit. So I have not bought any new running kit except for socks in the last, I want to say, 2 years. And, shirts and shorts, well, they could last for a long, long time. My current shorts have been patched multiple times now with Gorilla Tape, where they've started to rip. And they're still fine. I've got more than enough shirts to last a lifetime, which is one of the problems that we expose with the Green Runners. But I'm not taking any more from anything, and I haven't done for years. But probably the biggest realization for me was what I mentioned earlier, was that you can get brilliant secondhand shoes on Vinted. And, I've got a pair of trail shoes, which happen to have a carbon plate in. It's not what I was looking for, but they were in my size, and I got them for £50, and the RRP was about 180. And they'd been worn twice. Oh, so
this is the thing. I mean, you can wear trainers hundreds of times, and yet the fact that they're being discarded after, not discarded, sold on after a couple of wears is mad.
Yeah. So it was crazy, but it's such a great way of keeping things in circulation by looking at purchasing items for running through Vinted. And of course, it lowers the barrier of entry as well, because it's much cheaper. So that's one of my pairs of shoes. And then the other one I got was a similar case, pretty much the same price, and also pretty much brand new. So that was 2 pairs of pretty much new shoes that I got, that I didn't, have to pay brand new. What else have I done? I'm more conscious now about making efforts to reduce travel where possible. But where I live is not the easiest. So when I did the FKT,
right, yeah.
Yeah, I'm in Cornwall, so public transport is limited and infrequent. So I was quite keen for doing the FKT in a as low impact way as possible, which meant that I took my electric car to the start line, which was 25-minute drive away. And then I got 2 buses to get home again afterwards, which took probably 2.5 hours, but it was relatively painless. And then the following morning, just cycled 20 miles to pick up my car. So I only had to do 2 little car journeys. And yeah, it can be done. And this is in Cornwall. So there are plenty of races which are easily accessible by public transport. So even, 2 years ago, I did a 50-mile race, the Centurion Wonderland. And I stayed with my parents in Reading the night before, and then got the train to the start in the morning and did the race and got the train home again. So, it's not hard to do.
How do you feel about the rise of kind of adventure tourism and the idea that, we're sold quite a lot of these fancy trail races now where you can, fly halfway across the world and go for a run and come back home. Do you think that's a bad thing?
Yes. So I think tourism in general is a really interesting and challenging topic when we talk about climate and environment. I think that it's very easy to say that it's exposing yourself to a different culture and potentially your family and children as well. And that's like a really important life experience. And there's certainly some truth in that. And, I've had the pleasure of spending probably 2 months in China, and it was incredible. But the carbon impact of that trip was probably enormous. Well, I know it was, because of the number of flights and the distances involved. Now, I would probably say that there is limits to what I would reasonably call justified, I think, given the extent of the sort of planetary crisis that we are facing. When you put it into context, which is that I can't remember exactly, but a large percentage of the world have never flown before, and by us being sort of those in the Western world and relatively more wealthy, flying several times a year potentially, we're basically taking that away from the people who are living in the most affected areas by climate change, and also just don't necessarily have the means to do that. So I find it quite challenging, and I haven't personally landed in my head yet where I really feel about it, if I'm honest. I'm thinking I may take a flight for a holiday in sort of February next year. That would be my first for 3 years. And I haven't missed it. Like, I've had some great adventures in the UK in that time. And I think that probably more so we need to appreciate that you can find adventure nearer to where you are, or there are ways, okay, it's not necessarily easy, it's not necessarily cheap, of having those adventures in Europe, for example, if you're going from the UK without flying, because flying disproportionately has bigger impacts. But yeah, I guess my answer is I think that there's still a place for tourism, and adventure tourism is a different form of that, I think. But for me, it's that question of, is it really justified? And if you're going to go somewhere, definitely make the most of it. Don't just fly there for 2 days and fly back again and just do a race and that's it. Like, that, for me, doesn't feel quite right. I feel like if I'm going to go somewhere, we should spend time to sort of immerse yourself in the place that you're visiting, understand, what it's like to live there, I suppose, and I guess contribute a little bit more to their economy through the tourism that you're providing.
I was going to say, give something back.
Coming in and out again. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I think it's a really difficult subject as well, because so many people are very used to that being just the norm in the UK, for example. But yeah, personally, I find it quite difficult now to justify flying more than, let's say once a year, even for work purposes.
Yeah, I think when things have become the norm, like I said, we're used to flying in the Western world, and lots of people make several trips, sometimes per week, for business, and it shouldn't be normal, but it has been normalized, which makes it even harder to let go of these things. What do you think
Yeah.
are the hardest things that people should be giving up? Okay, we know flying, let's say that's the top one. At home, day to day, what is the top thing, but also the hardest thing that you reckon people should be giving up now?
This is where I kind of say meat and dairy.
That's great.
But the reality is that it's so easy, but it's so hard. Because it's so easy because there is a very viable, affordable alternative, but it's so hard because it is so entrenched in the society, and it's that causes it to be difficult for many people. But that is absolutely where I would start, because it's something that you as an individual have so much control over. You can choose every day, 3 times or more a day, what you are putting into your body, and whether that is more impact on the environment or less impact on the environment, and on animals as well, of course. So that's, the number one thing I would start with is simply looking at meat and dairy and what could you do to change how much you have. Just start with 1 meal a week, one or whatever is right. Don't feel that you have to go all the way in right away, because that's likely to fail. And then just embrace the fact that, you're trying something new and different, and enjoy the process, which sort of surprised me was that I was very fussy as an eater when I was growing up. So I was quite worried that I would have nothing to eat. And I had ham sandwiches every day for like 18, 20 years.
Crumbs.
But I sort of was really pleasantly surprised by how much I enjoyed trying different stuff, and like learning that there's actually a lot more out there. There's a lot more vegetables and things than you realize.
Yeah, when you have to.
And some of them actually do taste good.
So ultimately, David, it's a mindset shift, isn't it? And that's kind of the first thing we need to accept. It's a bit of a mindset shift. Have a try at new things, and also don't worry about failing ultimately at the start, because we all do that, don't we?
Yeah, and that's a sort of I guess a running metaphor as well. Is don't be afraid to fail and give it a go. And coming into sort of ultra marathons and things like that, it's, well, if you're always scared to fail, then you'll never do it, and you'll never give it a go in the first place. Which
really rounds this off beautifully, because obviously you've just achieved an FKT, so you were not afraid to give it a go. So well done you, and thank you so much for talking to me. It's honestly been so fascinating, like hearing all the insights from your world as well, and all the stats. And David, thank you again, and we'll catch up very soon, no doubt.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Laura.
Take care.
Thanks so much for listening, and don't forget to leave a review for the Vegan Fitness Runner podcast. Please subscribe if you don't want to miss an episode, and remember you can find out more about all my guests and further information on all the topics covered over on the website veganfitnessrunner.com. Thanks again, and bye for now.